I have a story about warrant officers. He was a super smart guy, but he just was also really stupid in a lot of ways. This was back when Napster first came out, and he basically got busted. He got a general order letter of reprimand because he was just sitting in the motor pool downloading music all day. And he was filling up all the bandwidth on the network. And at the time, nobody understood like what was causing this. And then they tracked it down to him. And, and
He got a Golar for using Napster.
it was just stupid.
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. We enter the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Top stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction contest.
Welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. Today we are 3 veterans, although typically we are 4 veterans, who are crazy enough to become writers, and we're here to talk about what makes great military science fiction. The greatest niche within a niche of any fiction. More niche than the Postal Inspection Force. On board is Rick Partlow, author of more than 60 novels. I think actually it's 70 novels now because you just passed 69.
69, dude.
Yep. Including the Contact Front and Drop Trooper series. Jeffrey H. Haskell, author of the Grimm's War series. Josh Hayes, who is not here today, but he's the author of the Valor series. And currently, I think his title at Athon Books is Operations Manager and Head of Thriller Acquisitions. And I'm James S. Aaron, author of the Aeon 14 Sentience Wars series and the Galactic Law series. Between the 4 of us, we bring more than...
Josh is getting tires of valor put on his car.
He is getting tires of valor put on his truck. So he's probably getting a second mortgage on his house right now, too. Between the 4 of us, we bring more than 100 novels written. Most of that is Rick, of course, but more than 30 years of publishing experience and military experience, officer and enlisted. And we'd probably be retired by now if any of us had stuck around. So join our Discord server to complain about the show and tell us everything you love about us. Bring a compliment my head. So today,
compliment Jeff's hair.
Compliment Jeff's hair. Yes. Today we're talking about rank. So as soon as I said rank, it was kind of funny because everybody, I think, groaned inwardly. But rank is obviously a big deal in any military fiction or science fiction. And I think it gets even harder in military science fiction because you have to imagine a rank structure in the future, typically tied around the type of military force, the weapon systems they're using, how they're operating, what the culture is. And so, yeah, there's a lot there. Rick, do you want to start? Like, how do you feel about rank and how have you used it? Or do you even start thinking about rank when you think about character and starting a story?
I do, because one of the first things I have to consider in a military science fiction story is the main character going to be enlisted or an officer when they start out, because there's a huge difference in the experience each of those has. And personally, I prefer to start out with an enlisted because they actually see more action. They have a more personal one-on-one view of combat, whereas an officer, at least theoretically, is supposed to keep like an overview, the big picture, to know where, even as a second lieutenant, you've got to know where all your squads are. You have to know where the next platoon is here, and the next platoon there, where what the company's doing at least. So to give everybody kind of a first-person shooter introduction into the universe, I feel like starting out with a private or even a sergeant, like a squad leader, is a good way to introduce a main character, introduce a world to new readers.
A trigger puller.
So, yeah.
It's relatable. I feel like that transition from civilian to private, or whatever you're going to call it, is something a lot of people can relate to. And it's just harder for people to relate to the lieutenant a lot of times, or even, that you get to like that break between officer and enlisted, and people just naturally don't like officers, in a lot of circumstances. And so
I think that I think it's easy for most science fiction readers to relate to like a brand new lieutenant
mhm,
just out of college who's lost and has everything explained to him, and that's a good tool for like explaining things because you're dealing with a character who may not know the details of all the stuff that he learned in his OBC. You know, he just knows
right.
the broad generalizations. So it's a good way to introduce your universe. And if you have a lieutenant, because private people are basically going to tell that private what he needs to know to do his job, but a lieutenant will usually get more explained to him about the big picture. So
Mhm.
you could get details about the enemy and the war you're fighting that you couldn't if there's just some like E5 telling a private how to maintain his weapon.
And lieutenant can be in a weird
You have
place.
failed to maintain your weapon, sir.
I know. Well, you're expected to think, but then you're also told to shut up and color. And so you're always in this weird place where how how much do I say? How much do I actually think about this? What is my span of control? And I think that's a big piece, like with any character, and what's the viewpoint on the story that you're trying to tell? Understanding rank, I think for me is a huge part of what, how you tell the story. And for me, it's a pet peeve when somebody obviously doesn't understand rank and has a character. We've kind of talked about this before, like has a character doing things that are just completely outside a rank structure, or they don't explain the rank structure clearly. And then you're
Yeah.
like, what? Why is the lieutenant talking to a general like that? But then one of the
Let
relationships
me
I find,
let me
what's
I'm
that?
saying let me put a caveat in there. That's
Yeah.
usually I write about ground combat. If I'm writing about space combat, then I don't want the low ranking person.
Okay.
I want like the captain of the ship or the weapons officer or somebody who's going to be there making decisions about the battle. You know, because
You
if you
want
write,
to be writing about the person who's being proactive. You don't want to
yeah,
be writing about the
I don't
guy
want
who's
to.
just following orders.
Yeah, I don't want an engineering tech and who doesn't know what's going on except that he has to repair this. I want somebody who's on the bridge, seeing the tactical display and either firing the weapon himself or being told to fire. I mean, or telling somebody else to fire it.
I won't mention the book series because I don't want to like shame anybody here, but I did read a sci-fi book series that, while interesting, the XO was constantly like second guessing the captain on the bridge in front of the crew constantly. And I was just like, man, somebody needed to watch that Star Trek episode where Data was in charge of the Enterprise. And he's like,
Old Warfin.
Mr. Worf, you would never have talked to Captain Picard the way you just talked to me. So it's
I
really important that your characters have autonomy. And part of why you see so many orphans in fiction is that, especially when the hero is underage, is that you can't have autonomy if you have parents telling you what to do. And while I've always wanted to tell a story that started off with someone in civilian life becoming, joining the military, kind of like Drop Trooper, joining the military, in going through training, and then, becoming a private and so on and so forth, all the way up to, master sergeant or whatever. Um, it does limit the scope of your story when they are, young and dumb.
Yeah. As for XOs, I generally avoid them altogether because I usually on my spaceships there's an auxiliary bridge that just in case the main one gets hit, and the XO is always banished to the auxiliary bridge, and you never talk to him, you never hear from him, except like in the mess hall or something. You don't, I don't know, whatever the Navy
Well, in
calls
terms
it,
of
but
economy, like if you're trying to limit number of characters you got to track, like an XO is just a second captain. Although, like, I guess, I mean, that's one thing. Like that relationship can be really powerful though. Like in Grimm's War with who's the XO? Is it Suki? I think. There's that
Kimiko?
Kimiko. That's right. Um, it gives like basically a view of the commander as a person who cares about um his crew, and then the XO is kind of an outside view on that, and also there's always a threat. I won't say there's a threat because I think it's pretty clear like Grimm's not going to get whacked. But like I think the reader then starts to invest in the XO and wants them to go on and do great things. So So I don't know. I can see both sides of that, like depending on how you want to play it or where you're going to go with the series eventually, if as you're developing characters. Because if the XO is just
I
there,
thought it
I
was
mean,
interesting how
you have plans for your XO later on in the series, and you have
yeah,
to flesh them out. But
yeah,
so far, I just like XOs have been wasted flesh for me.
yeah,
we don't really. I mean, like World War Mars, which is out now and is amazing. Um, you go with the Space Force, so I mean, it's not
Yeah.
really Navy anyways, which drives me crazy.
Well,
Um,
it's near future, but in my other
you know,
series, like in all the Birthright, Drop Trooper universe, all the fleet has naval ranks and naval setup, which is
the
why I guess I've never written a big ship novel in the Drop Trooper universe.
well, with Grimm's War, I mean, the XO is, obviously integral to the story just because they're usually like a foil for the captain, and
right,
someone to not just to bounce ideas off of, but you get like a different perspective and you can drop into, and with I do third person, so you can drop into the perspective and you can see the ship from a slightly different place. But I also do, when I was writing the first book, I had only a couple of POVs and I gave it to a friend of mine who has read all the same books that I've read. And I asked him, like, how can I make this better? Because I really wanted it to be the best thing that I could make at the time. And he's like, one thing I really like is when you get the guy in engineering who's trying to fix the ship in the middle of combat, when you get like some perspective from his points of view. And I went back and I read a whole bunch of my military sci-fi books that I've read in the past, and I realized that something that almost all of them do is like, yeah, you've got the captain of the ship is usually the main perspective, and you've got a couple of officers and maybe the Marines, but there's always like a junior enlisted guy who that's like his first time on a ship, or you have like the engineer who is just stuck in the bowels of the ship and he doesn't really know what's going on other than the alarms are ringing and he's got a whole breach to fix or whatever. And so yeah, I ended up doing that a lot, and it ended up being really like one of the best things I could have done. There are scenes in the books that are some of the best scenes, which are in the POV of somebody who you only really get one or two scenes from at most. But they're I call them spacers. They'd be seamen if they were today's Navy. Spacers don't. Spacers first class
Are we
or
not doing
PO
phrasing
third
anymore?
class. Uh,
well, it
and
creates tension too,
they're
because
not, they don't have a lot of autonomy
yeah,
other than how they go about doing their duty, and I thought that was pretty cool.
it creates tension because when you introduce this POV, you don't know if that person's going to immediately die. So that's sometimes something that when we jump to another,
Very
like
meta.
whenever I feel that whenever you jump to another character that you haven't met before especially during a battle or something, like, okay, we need to get an outside view, another view on what's happening here. But now is the author setting their hooks in me? So I'm going to care about this person, and then they'll just get blown away, you know, which works. Um,
As an aside, to get around the whole spacers, I in the Birthright / Drop Trooper universe, it's not called the Navy, it's called the Space Fleet. So everybody who's in it, people just call them Fleet. It's like, are you Fleet? Yeah, so that's a way to get around it.
Well, whenever I read a book series and it's set in space and they overly use nautical terms that are extremely specific to the ocean, it always brings me out of the story a little bit, you know. So that's why I changed seaman to spacer.
Space anchors away.
Yeah. But I mean, like, I also use a lot of terms that I've repurposed. Like in Gribbs War, when they drop an anchor, it's not to hold the ship still. It's so that they can find their place. They can find their way back to that specific place if they need to. So it's not connected to the ship. It's like a buoy. Or they have the towed array and things like that.
mm-hmm.
My idea has always been to keep things as relevant to people's minds of how they think now, but just change slightly. Weber is a master of it. He does it with the impellers and the Warshawski sails and things like that. I just thought that was genius that he did that, and so
Well, that's
I
how
did
it
try
works
to
in
echo
real
that a
life.
little bit in my writing.
I mean, so often a tool or, something has an origin that began and then transitioned over time, and people forget why it had that name. But, I don't know, it just makes sense to me. I think as long as you,
Yeah, me too.
yeah,
Yeah, me too. I try to have that sense of history and everything I do and create when I'm writing the series. Like I know in one of my books, they're repairing the outside of the ship in orbit, and one of the guys with them is just a spacer, and he's like, why do we even use coil guns? And the guy goes on and talks about the history of why they have coil guns in the Navy, and how they used to have just round shot and all this other stuff. And it's readers love that. I mean, they really do. They don't love it in the first chapter.
right.
Let's just be clear about that. They don't love it in the first 10 chapters. The art of an info dump is giving it to the reader when they want to have it.
And kind of getting back to our subject, I would say that the technology you have in propulsion and weapons kind of determines what your rank structure is going to be.
Right.
Because if you have large cruisers with a lot of crew, then you're going to have naval ranks eventually, however it starts out. I mean, even in my Earth at War series, where they start out with the Space Force, by the last book, everybody's starting to realize, we probably should have naval ranks, because, the ones we have right now don't make any sense for the jobs we're doing. But if you have small ships that are more like
Four-man
bombers,
crews, or yeah.
4-man, 5-man crew, then kind of an Air Force / Space Force type structure makes more sense. So that kind of determines how the ranks are going to be set up in your universe.
For sure. And then all the Navy ranks really based around the job you do. Like in the Army, you're private, right? And you might be an infantry private, or you might be a combat arms private, or you might be a REMF. But in the Navy, it's all like electricians, mates, second class, and
chief of boat. That should be chief of ship.
Chief of ship. Oh. I hope that dude's watching
The
this.
weird things about
never,
like,
ever.
My weapon system Patriot, when I was on active duty, the officers are also operators, the lieutenants are, and so that created a really weird, like, I had more in common with
I'm an operator.
Yeah, I know. The word
I put through 10 phone calls in one day.
Like when I first started hearing people say operator, I'm like, well, they operate a weapon. Like what? But so like you had more in common with the PA, because the PA was was responsible for the medical platoon, but also had to see patients. And so like I was responsible for operating the weapon system, like in fighting the air battle, but I also had to do all this other stuff as a leader. And so it created this, like, you had some people that were really good at, one or the other. And just like, I trained people that had come from other branches that were great at being platoon leaders, but then you get them in the van and they try and, just run the weapon system, and they just couldn't do it. And it was really, that I think is like interesting. Like one of the things we always sort of talked about was like, Patriot should actually be run by warrant officers, because they were the ones that had more time with it. And it had a really robust maintenance warrant officer, corps, but the Army being the Army, they weren't going to pay for a person who would just operate the system. Well, that was what other, like the Germans and the Dutch, that's how they do it. And so you had a person that was just really knew airspace control measures, how the system works, how, everything, threat analysis, and you got all that dumped on you as a lieutenant. And so that's something
that's something you don't see a lot in fiction too, is like warrant officers. Like I use warrant officers the way I feel like they're meant to be used, which is as technical experts. Because that's what they were in the Army. Like the guy who ran our motor pool was a warrant officer. He didn't run the motor pool. He was responsible for all the equipment in the motor pool.
Yeah.
And the maintenance and things like that. There was an officer who ran the motor pool. But officers, generally speaking, outside of the infantry officers and outside of line officers in the Navy are, even in the Navy, they're administrators. They're not action people. I know a lot of people are always surprised that, like, you guys remember that movie Navy SEALs back in the 80s?
Oh yeah.
With Michael Biehn and Hudson, or what's his face? Bill Paxton, and
Charlie Sheen.
Basically the cast of Aliens with Charlie Sheen. And
Charlie Sheen in Aliens would have been very interesting, but go ahead.
But and like they were all officers, and then like there was one guy who was like a chief, and that was actually the dude who went on to play the first sergeant in the unit.
Yeah.
years later, and he was also the president in Jack Bauer. But I was like, I had that perception of operators.
Snake Doctor
growing
was
up.
his name in the unit.
Huh?
Snake
Top.
Doctor was the name in the
Oh,
unit.
Snake Doctor, yeah, top, yeah, and great call signs in that show, and then you come to realize that no, officers aren't operators. There are no officer operators. They're administrators. They run the unit. They, if you go to the Special Forces group in Fort Lewis, it's the guys who are the actual operators are master sergeants and below. Same thing with Navy SEALs.
Sometimes warrant officers.
Sometimes warrant officers, the chief petty officers and below,
Yeah.
because the last thing you want is some 22-year-old lieutenant in the field as an operator pretending like he knows what he's doing. And so, getting back to ranks, I have a smattering of ranks all the way up from private to in the Marine Corps, spacer in the Navy, all the way to the captain of the boat. And I've got a warrant officer who flies the drop ship, and I've got chiefs, which are in the Navy. Chief petty officers are sergeant first class in the Army.
Oh, 7, okay.
And yeah, 7. I believe
I
it's.
think that's
I
what
could be
most people
wrong.
are used
So
to
if,
as a warrant officer pilot. I think that's what most people are
Yeah.
thinking about because of aviation. But
well, yeah, in the Army,
Well,
helicopter
in
pilots are
the
almost
Army,
all warrant officers.
helicopter pilots are usually officers. There are warrants, but there's more officers.
really, I guess I only ever met.
All the ones I flew with the exception of a couple of lieutenants, like the Blackhawks I flew on for the most part, were warrant officers.
I mean, I had a buddy that.
I had a friend from college who was an Apache pilot,
Yeah.
and he was telling me that almost all the Apache pilots were officers.
Well, yeah, that makes sense just because the 20-millimeter cannon on the front of the Apache.
I think
They
it
got a
might.
gunner too.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a buddy
True.
during Iraq that like when he made captain, he was pissed because he couldn't really fly anymore. Like it was really hard for him to get flight hours. But who knows? I think it could go either way. Like I think that's one of the things you could.
No, it's
If they are an officer,
Yeah.
then you can have them fighting against that. Like they don't want to get promoted, or in today's Army, it's pretty difficult if you either get promoted or get pushed, kicked out. But if your goal is to fly, you're going to find ways to. I mean, here's one thing I wanted to talk about. Like warrant is one of my favorite ranks, but like officers are very regimented in how they, at least today, and how they're promoted and what you have to do at certain times of your career. And, you basically would have to accept that you're going to go be an administrator. But if you're enlisted, like I love the idea of like a 40-year-old E5, like, because here's a guy that, or gal who may have been E5 like 3 times. And that's pretty interesting. Like, let's, whenever somebody has a story like that, like, yeah, I made E5 twice. Oh, well, tell me about that, and the Army is a place like where you can get busted and work your way back up. At least it used to be. I don't know if they're as forgiving these days, but that's always kind of interesting too.
They
like
better be,
age,
given how hard they're given the hard time they're having trying to recruit people. They better be more forgiving.
Yeah. But that's something I find like how age plays into rank. Like we've kind of touched on that. Like having a private, like in basic training. I went through basic training at 17, but we had a guy in basic training that was like 28 and he was the old man, and now I look back and I'm like 28 is not old at all. But you think about that, like here's a person who may have had a whole career or a family, or like I had a buddy who when I was in command with me that had been a mortician, and he was like one night he'd been a minister, a mortician, like he had a whole life before he came on active duty. And he just sat down one night and made a list of all the things. He was like basically going through a midlife crisis, and he was sitting next to a body at the mortuary, and he's like, I don't want to do this anymore. What job is going to give me all the things that I would like to do with my life? And it was the Army.
I want a
And
more exciting job. This one's dead.
yeah. But age, I think that's a really interesting thing too. And I do like the idea of people, like how you can play on that. Like you could have some people that are just like sandbags, they're useless, and other people that might be a private that has a master's degree. And, that's super interesting, at least to me. But then how does that create
when I went through
problems?
basic, there was a guy who was 32,
Yeah.
which at the time was the absolute cutoff. I think they've raised it since then, but he could not stop calling the drill sergeant sir. He's from the South. He's from Georgia, and the drill sergeant pulled him aside one day, and he's like, "Listen, I get it. You grew up. You're a polite young man, or you're a polite man, and it's yes sir and no sir and yes ma'am and no ma'am." He's like, "But you got to stop."
Yeah.
And it was a real struggle for him. But at the same time, he had a hard time getting along with some of the younger kids because, 18-year-old boys, they think they know everything, And the best advice I'd gotten, well, I gotten two pieces of advice when I joined. One was sleep when you can sleep, and the other was keep your mouth shut and your ears open.
Right.
And
The most
one of them I
interesting,
succeeded at.
huh, the sleep part, right? The most interesting E5 I ever met was about 40 years old. He was in a National Guard unit, and he had been in Vietnam with the 1st Marine Division. So he had been like an E5 in the Marines in Vietnam, gotten out, and then enlisted in the National Guard. Now he's an E5 again. He was almost 40. This is back in the late 80s. And he was a nutcase because he didn't take any of that seriously. So he would just do whatever he wanted. And he also got the choice schools and everything that he wanted to, for all that he showed like total insubordination in his actions. I mean, he was very polite, but everything he did was like totally wild. And he always be really polite and respectful to the officers when he did something like they just told him not to do.
When I was in the 90s, in the early 90s, it was funny is because you would meet E5s who had been in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Then you'd meet E5s who were 28 years old. It was so weird. And I only write a little bit about Marines. Like my highest ranking Marine is a gunnery sergeant, which I think is E6. And the rest are like corporals and privates and PFCs and whatnot. And then the vast majority of my characters are officers because it's Navy. Though I do have a lot of secondary characters that are chiefs and petty officers, which are like junior NCOs. So in the Navy, it's like you have spacers or seamen who are the enlisted like privates, and then you have the junior NCOs, which are the petty officers, 1, 2, and 3, 2, and 1, and then you have chief petty officers, 3, 2, and 1, and then you have master chiefs, which I don't have any of those in my book series because those generally don't serve on destroyers.
They generally fight at the Fall of Reach.
Lost my train of thought there, but I do have my warrant officer, my one warrant officer, chief warrant officer, Boudreaux, flies the Corsair, and I do mention that a couple of times in the series that warrant officers have a special place in the military, in that nobody can really tell them what to do too much, just because nobody knows the job that they're doing better than them, because if they did, they would be doing that job.
And those people don't understand where they fit in the rank structure at all.
Yeah. I mean, they outrank all enlisted. And for the most part, while they don't outrank officers, most officers won't tell them what to do because they don't know. Like, I don't know how to run a nuclear reactor. So you just go make it work and we'll go from there. And so you get a lot of laissez-faire with.
Have you ever read The General's Daughter?
No.
It also was a movie, but the main character is a Army CID agent, and they're all warrant officers. So it's funny because it's like one of those cases where nobody orders him around. The only one he reports to is the colonel, who's the provost marshal, and then his own colonel up in Virginia, who he almost never talks to. So he's like, he just wanders around, does what he wants, and people don't know how to treat him because he's a chief warrant officer 3, which is high as you could get at the time.
That's one thing with the
Reacher. Well, it's really interesting too, is because
I thought Reacher should have been a warrant officer. Like making Reacher a major never made a lot of sense to me.
Yes, he should have.
Yeah, that was weird that he was a major.
But that's because the guy who wrote the series is a Brit who has no military experience whatsoever.
Right.
He also didn't know anything about guns.
He should have been a warrant officer, but most likely he would have been like sergeant first class or he probably should have been a sergeant first class, to be honest. Reacher.
Well, I mean, if he was in CID, he would have been a warrant officer. But
if he was in charge in CID, but almost all the CID guys, the guys I met when I was in the Army, all the CID guys I met were all NCOs. All the CID investigators are warrant officers. Gotcha. Yeah.
but I mean, the MPs are all NCOs that
Yeah.
do their work. I mean, the CID guys just say, you go arrest this dude.
Yeah, exactly.
And
And
my lesson with
yeah,
warrant officers.
like you
Oh,
said,
go ahead, Jeffrey.
Kyle didn't really know what rank structure was.
I have a story about warrant officers. Two good friends of mine that became warrant officers. One, like, he was a super smart guy, but he just was also really stupid in a lot of ways. Like, this was back when Napster first came out, and he basically got busted. He got a general order letter of reprimand because he was just sitting in the motor pool downloading music all day. And he was filling up all the bandwidth on the network, and at the time nobody understood like what was causing this. And then they tracked it down to him. and and
He got a Golar for using Napster.
it was just stupid. And then another guy that I knew that I had him as an E5, and he had a full sleeve tattoos on his arms, and he played the whole game the whole time of he was going to get put out, not get put out, all this stuff. And then so I just knew him, and he was the kind of guy that could go get you anything. Like, he would go to the Air Force, make friends, come back with air conditioners, right, when we're all cooking our asses off. He went warrant and actually retired as a 5, which still just blows my mind, because I was like, this guy shouldn't have been anywhere near being a warrant officer. But that's the kind of stuff I love, like, as people, that sort of development, which I think rank allows you to do, because it's you've got a built-in progression, and you have to follow, like, depending on what your, culture is, like, in 18 months, you got to make, or even, 6 months, you got to make PV2. You could have come in as a PFC. Now you're going to be an E4, at least in the Army. There's kind of a, like, are you going to push on to E5? And all this stuff is like built in, and you can have characters push against that, or, they embrace it or they don't.
That's, I think the best thing about the advancing rank for a character is the added responsibility.
Right.
Because especially if your character is not used to being responsible for anyone but themselves, then putting people under them is a good way for to facilitate character growth. Because they may not care at all about these people. They may hate them.
Right.
But now they're responsible for them. So it's a good way to make them grow as a person, I think.
I like the whole premise of the first Grimswar book, Against All Odds, is that Jacob has a limited amount of time to make lieutenant commander, or they're going to kick him out. Because it's not just enlisted that have this problem. The military doesn't like lifelong lieutenants. You're not going to meet no 70-year-old lieutenants waiting to retire. And then the basis for that was, when I was in the Army, there was a specialist I knew, and he loved his job. He loved being a specialist. He did not want to be a sergeant. He didn't want to go on to be an NCO. He was a comms guy. He loved his job. He loved what he did. He loved working on radios, and they absolutely wanted to promote him. So he intentionally failed the test multiple times, and he got to 8 years as a specialist. And they said, if you fail one more time, you're out of the military. And he would rather have been out than he wanted to be a sergeant. So he ended up getting mustered out. And that always blew me away. Like here's a guy who knows his job backwards and forwards. Why get rid of him? But at the same time, the Army doesn't want 40-year-old specialists. It doesn't really do them any good. And that was the whole thing with Grimm, right? He starts off with a lieutenant. He starts off as a lieutenant senior grade, gets frocked to lieutenant commander, which is basically just like a temporary. There are some positions in the military you have to be a certain rank in order to have that position. And if they don't have somebody of that rank to do that position, they'll give you like a temporary promotion. And in the Navy, they call that frocking. And so they frocked him to lieutenant commander, and he had 18 months to become an actual lieutenant commander, or they were going to kick him out.
I love how
he'd
the Army
be frocked,
is like, screw off, lieutenant, you're in command. Like, you're not even promotable. You're just a commander.
Well, like they would do battlefield promotions, right? And they would be like, okay, you're for all intents and purposes, you're a captain, and then we'll see what happens when we get back, And that was the knowing and understanding the rank structure of the military allows you to do all kinds of like just amazingly cool things inside the story that you're telling. And this is where, like, either do your research really, really well and understand, because like I still have to research. It's not like I can just pull all this stuff off the top of my head. Almost everything I've said in this podcast is because I researched the hell out of it. And I was in the Army. but
Mhm.
I wasn't an officer. I only got to PFC. So, well, I got a specialist, but I ended as a PFC because I'm one of those interesting people who made ranks twice. And uh, the the so you have to understand it well enough and well enough that you know what questions to ask and where to ask them and where to look. Otherwise, you end up with things like I read a book once where it was in the far future and the guy had mixed Navy and Air Force ranks together,
Mhm.
well, Army ranks, and it was just like a colonel was the captain of the ship, but there was like engines and stuff, and it was just weird, and that always pulls me out of the story whenever someone does that. Now, I don't know if he did that intentionally or if he was just trying to be interesting, but whenever there's something like that that hits, for instance, the other day I was scrolling through Instagram and I found this reel, and this Marine recruiter, and this guy's telling this the sergeant's telling the recruiter who's an officer, he's like, yeah, she scored 99% on the men's PT test and on the ASVAB, and and this girl walks in and she salutes him, and the colonel's like, you're not enlisted, you're not signed up yet, you don't have to salute. And I'm like, well, then why did she take the PT test? Because you don't take the PT tests to get in the military. There's a physical you have to pass, but you don't do the PT test.
Is
It's
this the
mind
future
control.
or current day?
No, it was current day.
Yeah, it's just mind
It was
control.
current day.
How awesome you are. You pass the
And
test. So
she was like a buck 20,
yeah.
and they're like, she did 99% on the men's PT test. And I'm like,
Oh, she did.
that was written by somebody who doesn't understand what PT is in the Army or the Marines, and how few women score 300 on the men's PT test. Not to say that there aren't women that don't do it, but I've seen those women
They don't but they don't weigh 115
but they
pounds.
don't weigh a buck 20. No. And she just, and I mentioned this in the comments, and somebody's like, well, it's fiction. I'm like, yeah, but
It's
it's
not
also
in
based on
it's
something
not
that's
in an
real.
alternate, it's not alternate laws of physics, is it?
Yeah.
You can't
So
do
you
that
have
many
to,
push-ups that fast unless you have built up deltoid muscles. And if you do, you don't weigh a buck 20.
yeah. And you don't look like and you don't look like a stick figure. So
No,
you have to understand these
look like
things.
Ronda Rousey.
Yeah. And you have to understand these things in order to be able to make those, if you want a woman who can max the PT test in your story, and you want her to be really strong, then you have to give her like a reason to be really strong. You can't just be like, yeah, she was 5'2" and 115 pounds and she could bench press 600 pounds. It just,
She's a
yeah,
mutant.
Well, I think it comes back to like
weight.
how much thought have you put into like ranks exist for a reason. And that's one of the, like even comparing different nationalities. And when, we would interact with like say like doing training with another country, right? And me as a lieutenant, I'm training a captain, um, a Saudi captain, for instance, and the Saudi captain's not a leader. He's a person who bought his rank, bought his position for whatever reason, and now they've put him in this
Related, he's related to royalty.
potentially, yeah, he's part of the right tribe,
Can I
and
buy captain? Can I be a captain of a Navy ship? Is that
you
possible?
used to be able to do that in the U.S., but we have ranks for a reason, and the certain weapon systems, like there's a thing called MTOE, which what in my military I don't know, and you hear people say MTO, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but basically that's the structure of every unit that supports the mission of that unit. And so we're always
Well, TOE
debating,
is top table of operations and equipment, isn't it?
there it is. Yeah. Yep. But that breaks down like how many, do you need corporals or not? Do you have like how many squad leaders do you have? How many platoons should you have? Should you have a a heavy weapons platoon, and how many regular rifle platoons? And, all of these things, like they're always debating this because ultimately, like we've talked about this before, it comes back to money and politicians, right? And so a certain unit that's assigned to a certain area, like the politicians that run that, the senator or the Congress people there want more soldiers assigned to that post so they can bring in more money. So there are a lot of things you could play with, but you got to you don't have to have thought deeply into this, but there is a reason if you have a certain kind of weapon system or a ship or a mission, like somebody has put thought into how many people it takes to do that. And when you have a certain number of people, you have to control those people. You have a span of control for the leaders, and you can play with that too. Like if you drop like we've lost all of our all of our mid-level officers because the army sucks. We only have brand new, lieutenants coming out of ROTC. We're going to put one of those people in a command position. That creates a whole lot of tension there. If you've got a well-meaning person who doesn't have the experience and now needs to go perform a mission, or we're going to take that same person and drop them in a hearts and minds mission in Afghanistan, and now they need to go talk to leaders, 60-year-old leaders who could run circles around them when it comes to politics. This is all stuff you can play with, and I think rank is such a big part of that. But just having thought about it, I think it all makes sense. Yeah.
Another issue you might run into is, especially like if you're dealing with a nation or a planet or whatever that hasn't been at war lately, is that you're going to run into a situation where most of your officers went to their equivalent of a military academy because they've got a small military. Like in Drop Trooper, all the officers went to the academy, and they picked Marines or Fleet or whatever. And then the war started and officers started dying in the Marines. And they're like, well, we need more officers. We're going to have to set up an OCS, which they didn't have at the time because they hadn't been at war. And then you have to deal with all the ring knockers resenting the heck out of the people who used to be enlisted or NCOs and are now going through OCS in a few weeks and becoming officers.
If you don't know what a ring knocker is, like that's a play on West Point, where somebody went through West Point, you get your graduation ring, and so other West Pointers will look out for, basically you're part of the club, right? And so if you went to ROTC or OCS, you're not part of that club, and
no,
yeah,
and
which I didn't appreciate.
Ring knockers,
it.
Ring knockers make, looking at it objectively, not like I did when I was in, probably make better senior officers, but they make crappy second lieutenants because they think they know everything. And they have this sense of that they've achieved something really big by graduating West Point, which they did, but it doesn't make them any better second lieutenants or platoon leaders because they went through the same IOBC as everybody else. They have, unless they were prior enlisted or something, they have no more experience, being in an infantry platoon or a armor, or whatever than anybody else who went through OCS or ROTC. So, and the OCS guys usually know more than they do. They treat them worse, but they know more than they do about actual life in the Army. So,
and, I was combat arms because I was 31 kilo, which transitioned to 31 uniform, which is combat signaler. And I had probably 6 different first lieutenants who ran our platoon. And the 2 best ones, one was a Mustang and one was a West Point graduate. And while she was the West Point graduate, she was way more of a leader, I think, than the other ones, even if she wasn't necessarily capable of doing all the stuff that they could do. And the guy who was a Mustang was way more understanding of how it worked to be enlisted. And I like both of them. The rest of them, though, were either West Point graduates or Citadel graduates or whatever. And they were just, they wouldn't give you the time of day. They wouldn't pee on you if you
its
were
own
burning.
weird thing. Like, I don't even know why the Citadel gets to commission people, but it's
the Citadel. I knew a guy in my IOBC class who went through the Citadel. He hated it.
Yeah.
He said he spent his whole first year just scared out of his mind.
Something occurred to me that you just said, James, with all of us, including Josh, we have a really broad expanse. And I know we don't necessarily do guests, but we should get Kevin Eikenberry on to talk about being an officer in armor. Because he was a drinker. And
that's something I was going to mention, is that all the stuff about Marines and ships, you go into something like armor, that throws everything in a total.
Yeah, cavalry is completely different. Yeah.
I mean, when I was doing Drop Trooper, I struggled. Am I going to make this like infantry, or am I going to make it like armor? Because there's small units. There's only like 8 of them to a squad, and they count on mobility. They're not like digging in defensive positions. They're constantly on the move, sort of like armor. It was hard.
They're more like Rangers. They're QRF. Your guys, Drop Trooper, are more like Rangers than anything else.
When I did wholesale slaughter though with mechs, I definitely made that like armor because it didn't make any sense to do it any other way.
My
Yeah,
instructor,
and
I was just saying, my small group instructor in the officer advanced course was a tanker, and it was it was such a, everybody like bags on air defense because we like to think we're brainiacs and it's supposedly a combat arms, but then we get this guy as our trainer that's like, we want to be in trenches slitting throats, and we're all like, we don't really think about slitting throats. We think about airspace control measures.
We're in air conditioning.
Well,
that's an interesting take. Just slits throats.
I know. Well, it was, I think, a really important take because, that was a big wake up call for Patriot in particular when you're following maneuver units through Iraq and everybody starts hitting, follow on units. And it was, an important thing to think about that a lot of people didn't think a lot about at that time. But that was like, that mentality was refreshing. I guess it was just a really, so yeah, I would love to get Kevin in, to talk to him. Cause I think that's one thing. Like, I didn't even know what, like, you have a tank commander, but are they doing, like, I would assume they know how to do all the pieces of running the tank, but they don't have to actually run the tank unless they lose somebody. But I don't know. I would love to
Well,
hear more about that.
I wouldn't know that
Yeah,
because the couple of guys I knew who ran tanks, the tank commander was a lot like a captain of a ship.
right.
You have an officer who is in charge of the tank, but the rest of the guys are enlisted or whatnot. You don't have a lot of second lieutenants driving the tank.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's get him on and talk about that. And we can ask him some of the questions we've answered too about rank and stuff. You mentioned in the beginning, James, what our favorite ranks were to write, and I think
Mhm.
probably my favorite rank to write is there's a mix of two, which would be the gunnery sergeant in the Marines and captain of a ship. Those are my two favorite ranks I like writing because you get I get to go in the ground and do all the stuff, and the other is I get to be in charge and be Kirk, and I like both of those.
Nice. Rick, how about you?
I don't know that I have a favorite rank. I don't have a favorite rank. But I kind of like somebody who's going to be more, like I said, the point of the spear. So usually squad leaders and platoon leaders for Marines, just because they both they get to be there at the front, shooting, and they also have an idea of what the big picture is. So I don't want necessarily a private or a lance corporal just knowing whatever's in front of him. I want somebody who's knows what's going on in the big picture, so the reader knows, but they also have the experience of shooting what's in front of them. But like Jeff said, when you're talking about ship combat, I definitely like the captain, unless it's like I have written stuff where there's small, like interceptor style cutters, and those are a lot more fun to write about because you have like the best of both worlds, because there are starships, so they can be proactive and go do stuff and not worry about their fuel running out or the reaction mass running out, and yet they're also kind of not outlaws, rogues, but they're on their own. They're wildcats. They're doing stuff out from under people's noses. But I don't like writing about fighters that much because when you look at it, space fighters are not realistic, not really a good idea. With it, unless you have magic technology that lets them go, like have some kind of a non-reaction style drive where they don't have to worry about reaction mass, because anything that small that you can only carry a little bit of reaction mass. And I dealt with this in one of my earlier series, that people in these things they're basically risking suicide every time they go out, because you go out, you run your mission, and if it goes just a little bit wrong, you're drifting with no reaction mass, waiting on the ship that you came out of to come pick you up, because you can't get back to them. But I like those style, like those interceptors, that are like a mid-sized ship, crew of 3 or 4.
You mean like a Corvette?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're they have more in common with long range bombers than corvettes. But yeah, but that I like that when I do any kind of fleet stuff, because I don't like having to keep track of all the secondary characters on a big ship and have to, like, oh yeah, what are they doing in engineering right now? Oh, what are they
See,
doing?
I love that logistics of everything. One
Yeah,
of the things I always felt like in Star Trek Voyager that they completely missed the boat on was that aspect of the show. Like every week there were new characters in the background that you never would see again, and every week they always had their shuttles back and everything. And I felt like they completely missed the boat. They could have had a pool of actors that they drew from that you were constantly seeing those guys in the background, and when one of them died, they'd be emotional. And
yeah, that's true.
that's part of why I like writing. Now you get too big of a ship and that's impossible to do. The Grimm's Interceptor is got a max crew of 130, so it's not like it's, I based it more off a Gatto than a Fletcher. But you're not running into a situation where there's like so many people I can't keep track of, because I don't introduce anybody I'm not going to keep track of. But yeah, I know what you mean though. It's nice to be able to focus on the books I have the most fun writing are the ones where they're on like a secret mission, and there's nothing, they're not acting as part of a fleet. There's no fleet maneuvers. There's no, other ships to worry about. Yeah, so I get you there.
One thing I've run into in Drop Tripper, there in the current arc of that story, they have been kind of lost and unable to get back home for several years now. So you have people who are in positions like the helm officer or the tactical officer who are in, their actual rank is like commander or lieutenant commander, but they have years and years of experience. And if they hadn't gotten cut off from everyone, they would have been running their own ship for years. So it's interesting trying to keep that dynamic going too with the ranks.
Friggin' 20-star general by now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think my favorite, I would have to agree. It comes back to span of control, like Rick was mentioning, but I love writing lieutenants just because I was a lieutenant, if I'm going to be indulgent there. But sergeant, because I feel like there's a lot of pressure on that rank to grow, and like that's a change point for anybody. Like for me, it's like I like E4s, but and the whole like E4 mafia I think is funny to me, just because I was an E4. But you got to make that at that point in your life. You got to make a decision. Am I going to grow up, or am I a leader, or am I not a leader? And I think that's like, even for lieutenants, like people tell them they're leaders all the time. Like you're going through these training programs, they tell you you're a leader, but until you're really in front of that person, telling them to do something they don't want to do, you don't know if you're a leader or not, and you care about people. Like that's something that always really matters to me about ranks. But then battalion commander is one I like a lot too, because I think you can have like battalion commander is like, am I an executive leader, or what kind of leader am I? Because a lot of people fail as battalion commanders because they still want to act like company commanders or even platoon leaders and be right down there in the fight, and they haven't transitioned to that bigger picture and knowing how to really utilize their weapon system to the best, like to accomplish the mission. So I don't know, all that's interesting to me, and I don't know anything about the Navy, so I can't talk to that, but I do like, when it comes to ships, I agree.
Speaking of transition,
gotta be a captain. Go ahead.
Speaking of transitions, we should probably transition to the end.
We should wrap it up. I just had to get my my opinion in there. So, all right. Thank you.
No, absolutely.
Thank you for listening. Thanks for hanging out with us. If you've got a favorite rank, bring it to the Discord and let us know, especially if you disagree with us, or agree. If you had an experience with somebody of a certain rank that stuck with you, we'd love to hear about it.
If you were multiple ranks the same over and over again, let us know.
Yeah, we'd like to hear about
that.
Would
be interesting too.
Tell us how you got busted.
If you're a warrant officer, we'd like to know all about it, because it's such a mystery.
I know. Do you exist? Do we ever see you? All right. Yeah. Well, thanks for hanging out, and we'll talk to y'all next time. See you later.
Lone troopers on the hit and jump gate, military science fiction podcast.